Much like my existence, the furnace was a mistake. Not because it was too strong, but because Clash Royale was never built for a card like it. For years, it sat in the shadows of the game, ignored, underpowered, and quietly forgotten, and then one update flipped everything. Supercell didn't repair it, they broke the rules and reinvented the card from the ground up. Suddenly, this forgotten building became a roaming, lane-warping menace that no one was prepared for.
Furnace, 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 furnace! Everyone and their mom's dogs, squirrels, kitten is playing Furnace right now.
This is how a card that never should have worked almost took over Clash Royale. Before the Furnace was ever reworked, and before it was even introduced as a building, we had the beta. And this beta was a very different game from what we know today. Not worse, not better, just simpler, slower, and far more experimental. Which makes sense. This wasn't a finished product yet. This was Supercell throwing ideas at the wall and seeing what would stick. The core of the game was already there. Lanes, towers, elixir, troops, spells. But the pacing, the balance, the role of certain card types, all of that was still being figured out. And nowhere was that more obvious than with buildings. In the beta, buildings were not just defensive tools, they were foundations. They had way more health, longer lifetimes, and they were also more expensive. This wasn't accidental. A lot of Clash Royale's early design DNA was clearly pulled straight from Clash of Clans, where high HP defensive structures are the backbone of every base. That philosophy carried over into early Royale. Sometimes a little too well. Take the cannon, for example. Back then it cost 6 elixir, the same that the X-Bow costs now, but with a completely different role. It had huge health, long range, and a lifetime that made it feel like it never disappeared. Instead of being a cheap cycle building, it functioned as a full defensive investment. Once you placed it down, the entire match could start floating around that one structure. Then there was the mortar, also 6 elixir, also absurdly powerful. It dealt massive damage, had extreme range, and in many matches, forcing a mortar lock felt like an entire win condition. If it connected to your tower, the game could snowball instantly. And on top of that, X-Bow could target air. That one change alone sounds small until you realize what it meant for gameplay. There were fewer reliable air units at that time, fewer hard counters, and suddenly a long-range building could not only shred ground pushes, but also shut down air pressure completely. In modern Clash Royale, that kind of versatility would be unthinkable on a win condition. Because of this, early beta matches often felt heavier, more static, and more defensive. You'd see long stretches where both players built up structures, waited for openings, and slowly chipped away rather than constantly pressuring. It wasn't inherently bad. In fact, some players loved how methodical it felt. But it could get stale, especially when both sides invested into tanky buildings that refused to disappear. At the same time though, that slowness is exactly what made the beta valuable. Supercell could clearly see which buildings stalled games too much, which ones decided matches too easily, and which mechanics simply didn't translate well from Clash of Clans into a real-time PvP card game. So over the first few weeks, buildings were being changed to fit Clash Royale a bit more. Health values adjusted, lifetimes shortened, roles redefined, and by the time May rolled around, the game was already moving in a new direction. Because by the time the Furnace released on May 5th, 2016, Supercell had figured out buildings. Kind of, but we'll get to that. Before we can properly talk about the Furnace, we first have to understand the card it completely revolves around, the Fire Spirits, because when the Furnace released on May 5th, 2016, it didn't just introduce a new building, it introduced an entirely new type of unit to Clash Royale at the same time, that being the very first Spirit card, and it worked very differently from what we're used to today. Back when Fire Spirits were first released, they weren't a single 1 elixir unit like they are now. Instead, they cost 2 elixir, and you got 3 separate spirits for 1 card. 3 smaller, more fragile units instead of 1 larger, stronger one. And mechanically, they were unlike anything else in the game at that time. Fire Spirits could only attack once, they didn't swing, they didn't shoot, they just threw themselves directly at enemies and exploded on impact, dealing all their damage in a single instant. It was a mechanic pulled almost directly from Clash of Clans, identical to the idea of the wall breaker, and just like wall breakers, they shared the same weakness. If you managed to kill them before they reached their target, well, nothing would happen. No explosion, no damage, just gone. That single design choice already made Fire Spirits feel completely different from normal troops. They weren't meant to survive, they were meant to connect. or fail completely. And because of that, fire spirits added a genuinely new dimension to the game. You can almost think of them as 3 fragile but extremely powerful wizards, placed directly under your control for just 2 elixir. They can hit ground and air, they dealt huge burst damage, and they absolutely deleted medium health swarm units if they connected. But they weren't unstoppable. One of their biggest limitations was simple pathing. The bridge acted like a bottleneck, meaning they often couldn't all reach the same target. Against something like a spread out group of barbarians, they might only hit 1 or 2 instead of all 3. They were also incredibly fragile. Zap killed them instantly. Any ranged splash troop could wipe them out. And against single, tanky units or high health buildings, they were awful. Anything tankier than barbarians usually just shrugged them off, but despite those weaknesses, fire spirits immediately found a role. They were a hard counter to Goblin Barrel. Wherever the barrel landed, the fire spirits would chase it down and relentlessly hunt the goblins. If the goblins spawned together, all 3 could connect. If they surrounded the tower, each spirit would usually lock on to 1 goblin apiece. Either way, it was still a positive elixir trade. For a brand new unit with a completely unique attack style, they were genuinely interesting. Players liked them, they felt fresh. They almost behaved more like tiny living spells than traditional troops. Not something you built pushes with, but something you used to shut down threats instantly. And that context is critical for what comes next, because the furnace wasn't just a building, it was a spawner, like the Tombstone, Barbarian Hut, and Goblin Hut. And just like those early spawners, the furnace landed in a very awkward place. It wasn't great at defending, it wasn't great at attacking, and it mostly existed to slowly chip away at towers and buildings over time. And when a card isn't really great at anything, it's usually destined to be underused. And that is exactly where the Furnace's story truly begins. Because now that you understand the 2016 Fire Spirits, we can finally talk about the Furnace itself. Hey, sorry to break the flow, but please consider subscribing to the channel so I can continue to make these videos. They take a ton of effort and time, and your support means the world. So thank you. Now, back to the release of the Furnace. So, the Furnace was released as a 5 elixir building that would spew out fire spirits periodically. The Furnace was a rare card that unlocked in Spell Valley, and on paper, it looked like it fit right in with the other spawner buildings of the time. Once placed, the Furnace would summon 2 fire spirits every 10 seconds, for a total of 6 waves over its 50-second lifetime. This meant 12 fire spirits in total, and in terms of raw value, it was very similar to cards like the Goblin Hut. But where things got interesting was how spells interacted with it. If you hit the Furnace with lightning, it would prevent 4 out of the 6 waves from ever spawning. Poison was even more nuanced. It prevented 3 full waves and then killed the 4th wave as it spawned. So even though the Furnace generated value over time, it was also extremely vulnerable to spells. At first glance, the Furnace also looked like it would naturally pair well with the other huts, but with a cost of 5 elixir, that just wasn't valuable. In its first week, it sat at a 6% usage rate in top ladder, which might seem good, but back then there were way less cards, so naturally usage rates would be higher. And it was a new card, so people were more prone to trying it out. And as we can see, the very next snapshot, Furnace sat at a 0% usage rate already. The card just didn't provide any real value, and it was a similar story for the Fire Spirits. They weren't being used a lot either. But on the 18th of May, less than 2 weeks after the release of the Furnace, it was already slightly reworked. Its elixir cost was reduced to 4, but its lifetime was decreased from 50 seconds down to 40. And its hit points were decreased by 14%. The Fire Spirits did get an increased splash radius though, going from 1.2 tiles to 1.5, allowing them to splash into more troops more easily. And it seemed that this did have a little impact as it jumped back up to 5% usage rate from 0. And when a buff in June increased its duration back up to 50 seconds without any nerfs, it basically meant it would spawn 1 extra wave of Fire Spirits without a single trade-off. It jumped to an outstanding 18% usage rate, mainly being seen in Minor Control. In this deck, it was all about chipping away at the enemy tower, and the Furnace could do just that. The Minor could tank for the spirits and allow 2 connections as well. It would also be able to provide solid defensive value against many troops, but this was a short reign, as with the introduction of the Ice Spirit and other factors, it would die down quickly, dropping to a 0% usage rate once more. But in November, we see the furnace climb back up to 15%, back in those same minor control decks, but also seen in every single Royal Giant deck. See, it worked well with the Royal Giant, as the Royal Giant had a really long range during this time, which meant that the Fire Spirits wouldn't need to travel a lot to support him. And this only proved to be more true nearing the end of 2016, as we see the furnace rise to a 25% and even a 32% usage rate. In the snapshot of December 5th, Woody says, quote, "Tombstone stumbled as Furnace and Cannon picked up steam in the competition for the defensive building deck slot." And in the final snapshot of the year on December 20th, Woody says that Furnace has done well in heavy decks that need a constant stream of damage to counter their faster opponents, all while earning chip damage on the tower for an elixir cost just one higher than the recently nerfed Tombstone. So it's clear that it was competing with Tombstone, and it's even more clear when we take a look at the differences in usage rates. On November 8th, the Furnace sat at a 4% usage rate, whereas the Tombstone sat at a whopping 56%, and by December 20th, the Furnace had a 32% usage rate, whereas Tombstone had 21. That's a 34% decrease for the Tombstone and a 28% increase for the Furnace. This happened because on November 30th, the Tombstone received a pretty big nerf. It would now spawn skeletons every 2.95 seconds instead of 2.55. This might not seem big, but it's an extra half second, and that meant skeletons would spawn less frequently. Well, duh. And thus you'd also get way less skeletons overall. And throughout the start of 2017, the Furnace was still going strong, being seen in several different decks. But at the end of March, players started to notice something. Why would I use my Furnace or Tombstone to defend when I can simply soak up the damage with something like a Bowler or Ice Golem and have a greater counter push? And that's what led to April 4th. The Furnace, for the first time in over half a year, dropped to a 0% usage rate in top ladder. And ever since that day, it's not reached anything above a 4% usage rate. The Furnace was terrible, and it wasn't seen as a strong or even viable card for years. It was only rarely seen in some Royal Giant decks, so what happened to it? Did it get hit with a big nerf? Was there a new building that outshined it? Well, the real issue maybe wasn't the Furnace itself, but more so what it spawned. You see, it's not like the Fire Spirits were thriving when the Furnace was down in usage rate. They usually sat even lower. The Ice Spirit offered way more value for only one elixir. It could freeze troops, reset Inferno charges or Prince charges, and even survive a zap. So yeah, why would you use Fire Spirits for 2 elixir? And this weakness that the Fire Spirits had automatically translated to the Furnace over time. The Furnace became a below average card and was only seen inside of Royal Giant decks in top ladder. So we're gonna take a big jump here to February of 2020, where Barbarian Hut receives its rework, now spawning Barbarians on death. That single change guaranteed value even if the building got removed very quickly, and it completely revived spawner popularity across the board. Furnace didn't benefit much from this directly, but the environment was already starting to shift. Then in April of that same year, Goblin Hut got the exact same treatment. Death spawn units, guaranteed value, and suddenly the spawner hierarchy was completely flipped. Goblin Hut exploded in usage and instantly became Furnace's biggest competitor, whereas before this, it was Tombstone. Barbarian Hut was stronger than before too, but Goblin Hut directly invalidated Furnace's niche. And with spawners flooding the meta, something else rose with them. Earthquake, a spell that hard countered Furnace in particular. The Furnace wasn't even in the meta, but with Earthquake entering the meta, it would become even more irrelevant than it already was. So once again, Furnace found itself in a meta that was actively hostile toward it. But now there was another problem. By this point, every spawner in the game produced units on death. Every unit except Furnace. So naturally, most players expected the next balance change to finally bring Furnace in line with the rest, but instead, May of 2020 delivered one of the harshest nerfs Furnace ever received. Its hit points were reduced by 16%. But why? It was already below average, it was only seen in Royal Giant, if it was seen at all. For a card that was already struggling, this was brutal. At the time, Furnace was sitting as a bottom 10 card in competitive play, and yet Supercell explained the nerf by saying Furnace was overused and frustrating on mid-ladder, despite performing poorly everywhere that actually mattered competitively. That just didn't sit right with a lot of players. If mid-ladder frustration was the standard, then why target Furnace instead of cards like Wizard, Mega Knight, Expo, or Hog Rider, which all were more overused, more complained about, and performing better competitively at the time? It felt inconsistent, and for Furnace players, it felt unfair. Now, technically, this wasn't the full story. At the same time, Earthquake was receiving a building damage nerf, which indirectly buffed all buildings, but Supercell clearly didn't want Furnace to benefit from that. So while Barbarian Hut and Goblin Hut had their health toned down, the Furnace was also dragged down, leaving Furnace and Goblin Hut with roughly the same hit points afterward. On paper, that looked like consistency, but in reality, it wasn't. Every other spawner got death units, guaranteed value, and compensation for their health changes. But all the Furnace got was a massive HP nerf, and nothing in return. And the result was pretty predictable. After May of 2020, almost any high damage card could deny multiple Furnace waves. Preventing just one or two spawns completely destroyed its value, and Earthquake was still everywhere. By August of 2020, Furnace was recorded as the second lowest use rate and the second lowest win rate in Grand Challenges. One of the worst cards in the entire game. Strangely, on lower ladder, Furnace actually remained the best performing spawner for a short time after the nerf, not because it was good, but because everything else was still being adjusted. And that didn't really last long. In September of 2020, Furnace received its final change of the year. Technically a Fire Spirit buff, not a Furnace buff. The Fire Spirits got a 0.2 tile splash radius increase, going from 1.5 tile radius to 1.7. Even then, Supercell openly stated that this change was temporary because they already had plans to eventually rework Fire Spirits into a single unit card, and that made the buff feel strange and honestly almost pointless. It barely changed any real interactions anyway. Sure, it might splash a little better in some situations, but it wouldn't counter things that it couldn't counter before. And after being well over a year at the bottom of the game, Furnace's long-awaited rework finally arrived in June of 2021, and it wasn't a small adjustment. This was one of the biggest full overhauls any card had ever received. Nearly every key stat tied to both Fire Spirits and the Furnace itself was changed at once. First, let's talk about the Fire Spirits. Each individual Fire Spirit now dealt 6% more damage, but more importantly, their hit points were increased by a massive 109%. Their splash radius was expanded by 0.8 tiles, nearly a 50% increase, and their jump range was extended from 2 tiles to 2.5. These weren't just number tweaks, they completely rewrote how Fire Spirits interacted with the game. For the first time ever, a single Fire Spirit could fully counter a center-placed Goblin Barrel on its own. That meant Furnace could now be used as a legitimate reactive spawner, trading just one elixir down for a full barrel shutdown, as long as one wave was enough. Another massive change was survivability. It now took 3 Princess Tower shots to kill a Fire Spirit, meaning a single spirit could reach the tower on its own, without needing support like a miner tanking for it. And with the increased jump range, it could now strike first against cards like Baby Dragon and Bowler, which completely flipped several long-standing interactions. But because each Fire Spirit was now so much stronger, Furnace obviously couldn't keep spawning them the same way, so Furnace itself was reworked as well. Instead of spawning 2 Fire Spirits per wave, it now spawned only 1. Its total lifetime was slightly reduced, but the spawn interval was shortened by nearly 3 seconds, meaning that despite living a bit shorter, the Furnace actually produced 2 additional waves overall. Now on paper, the total combined damage of all spawned spirits ended up being over 25% lower than before, which sounds like a huge nerf, but in real gameplay, it was the total opposite. Before the rework, getting full value out of all 12 original Fire Spirits was almost impossible. After the rework, you were now realistically getting 8 much stronger spirit connections instead of 6 weak ones, resulting in roughly a 29% increase in real tower damage, with total chip damage reaching nearly 60% of a tower's health if left unchecked. Of course, there were trade-offs. If you tried to use the furnace as a full defensive shutdown against heavier threats like Princess or Minion Horde, a single Spirit Wave often wasn't enough anymore, and in setups where you used a tank like Miner to absorb damage, you could no longer benefit from the double Spirit Burst either. But this wasn't meant to be a simple buff or nerf. This was a complete identity shift. In total, the Furnace rework involved 7 major stat adjustments. An insane number for a card that wasn't even dominating at the time. But the key difference here was that this rework had been announced 9 months earlier. Supercell had clearly been testing and planning it behind the scenes for a long time. This wasn't rushed, it was engineered. So the question wasn't what changed anymore, it was what would this new furnace actually do to the game? After the massive June 2021 rework, things finally looked stable. The new fire spirits were simply more consistent, with better survivability, a larger splash radius, and improved jump range. They connected more often, wiped swarms out reliably, and were far less awkward to use. From a pure design standpoint, the spirit rework was clearly successful. But the furnace itself, that's where things get a little more complicated. Before the rework, furnace spawning 2 spirits per wave created depth. It wasn't just about passive chip. You could support those waves, tank for them, add extra value with smart play. Post-rework, that layer of strategy disappeared. The spirits were stronger, yeah, but the furnace itself became one-dimensional. Still, for a brief window, Furnace was in a healthy place. It reappeared in control-style decks, especially ones built around Elite Barbarians and Mother Witch. The old Royal Giant Furnace pairing had faded away by then, Mother Witch had taken that role instead, and despite how massive the rework was, Furnace usage didn't suddenly explode. It was probably intentional. Supercell likely wanted the rework to stabilize the card, not make it oppressive again. And for a few months, it worked. But then the meta ran into an issue. The newly buffed Fire Spirit versus Goblin Barrel interaction was completely game-changing. A 1 elixir Fire Spirit hard countering a 3 elixir win condition made Logbait borderline unplayable overnight. That single interaction caused some massive backlash. So in September of 2021, Supercell responded by reducing Fire Spirit's splash radius from 2.5 tiles down to 2.3. Technically, this also affected Furnace, but in reality, it barely mattered. Furnace wasn't dominating and wasn't responsible for the interaction causing problems. Even then, Furnace's usage only dipped slightly. If anything, this was arguably the best balanced state Furnace ever had. Useful, niche, and not oppressive. Unfortunately, that wouldn't last. By November of 2021, Furnace usage started rising again. Split lane pressure decks using Golden Knight, along with Furnace plus Goblin Hut, became common. Statistically, Furnace was still average, but emotionally, it felt oppressive. Community frustration exploded yet again, so in December of 2021, Supercell dropped another rework. And this one was devastating. Hit points were cut heavily, allowing spells like Earthquake and Poison to fully counter it without leaking a final wave. Their lifetime was reduced by nearly 1/3, a colossal nerf. Wave interval was shortened to 6 seconds, and for the first time ever, Furnace gained a Death Fire Spirit. On paper, it looked like compensation. On reality, it was a death sentence. Furnace now spawned fewer total spirits, couldn't be stacked anywhere near as effectively, and lost the one trait that had always defined it: long-term pressure. Supercell themselves had once stated that Furnace's extended lifetime existed specifically so players could stack them and build layered pressure. That core identity was now gone, and the timing just made it even worse. Just weeks earlier, champions had been introduced. With the 3-card cycle mechanic, players could reach Furnace faster than ever, which had briefly made stacking powerful again. Instead of adjusting for that interaction, Supercell removed stacking entirely. And then came the final blow. Fire Spirit's jump range was reverted back to 2 tiles. That one change alone destroyed their consistency. Ranged units could now stop them far more reliably, and because Furnace spawned faster, those counters could shut down more waves than ever before. After December of 2021, Furnace didn't just fall off, it collapsed. Its use rate and win rate dropped to the lowest they'd been since before the June 2021 rework. And this time, it didn't recover. 2022 was Furnace's worst year yet. It remained a bottom 5 card across the board and disappeared entirely from competitive play. Its only balance change that year was another indirect hit. Fire Spirit's damage was reduced by 9% because the solo spirit was overperforming. Furnace received no compensation whatsoever, despite being hit even harder by the change than the card it was meant to balance. Meanwhile, Barbarian Hut and Goblin Hut both received reworks and attempts to revive them. Furnace was left untouched again, and that alone said everything. In 2023, Furnace technically received another rework, but it was a shallow one. Its lifetime was shortened again, while spawn speed increased slightly. Supercell claimed this would make it, quote, more effective all around, but in reality, it solved none of the card's fundamental problems. It still couldn't stack properly, it still folded instantly to spells, and it lacked any real niche. Predictably, nothing changed. Ironically, spawner hatred returned anyway when Spear Goblins received a ranged buff, pushing Goblin Hut back into the meta very briefly. Players once again demanded spawners be nerfed or deleted entirely, even though Furnace itself was nowhere to be found. After Goblin Hut was shut down in mid-2023, all 4 spawners were quietly abandoned, because with the introduction of evolutions, every card that wasn't evolved became worse in comparison. The Furnace was already buried, but with evolutions added to the mix, it may have been buried forever. If the Furnace was struggling before, well, 2024 put the final nail in the coffin. The introduction of tower troops shattered what little role Furnace still had. The Cannoneer could one-shot Fire Spirits, completely removing Furnace's passive chip. Other spawners could still apply some pressure. Furnace couldn't. Then came the Dagger Duchess, which invalidated it even harder. Then came the Void Spell, a cheap, flexible way to erase Furnace instantly, similar to Earthquake but less meta-dependent. And at that point, using Furnace became genuinely laughable. By the end of 2024, Furnace had once again sunk to one of the lowest use and win rates in the entire game. So what was next? We've basically seen 2 reworks up to this point, and it's still one of the worst and most annoying cards in the game. Could it maybe get an evolution to help it bounce back for good, or would that make it even more of a nuisance without fixing the true problem? Well, what if in 2025 we got one of the biggest reworks ever and an evolution? That's right, in August of 2025 we got a complete overhaul and an evolution. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's talk first about the rework and what really changed. When Furnace was reworked, it stayed a 4 elixir rare, but mechanically it became a completely different card. It was no longer a building at all. Instead, it turned into a slow-moving ranged troop that constantly spawns fire spirits as it walks up the arena. If you play it in the back, it can still generate a similar number of spirits to the old Furnace, meaning the theoretical value is actually higher now because you're also getting a free ranged unit with it. But in real matches, that value becomes far more inconsistent since you often have to drop it higher on defense. Its regular attack is slow and low damage, but it makes up for that through the spirits it produces. Its range matches cards like Musketeer and Flying Machine, letting it both hit air and ground from far away. Because its damage per hit is low and its attack speed is low, it also ends up being one of the few ranged troops that doesn't completely lose to Monk, since reflected damage is far less punishing than with heavy hitters or units that shoot quicker. One of the biggest skill-based changes comes from its spawn timing. A fire spirit appears almost instantly the moment the furnace is placed. That means you can drop it behind a push to instantly catch a predicted swarm, or place it on the river so that the first spirit actually spawns on the opponent's side. The timing is brutally precise though. Mistime it by half a second and a clean defense can turn into massive tower damage. Get it right though and you can pull off some absurd positive traits. Defensively, the reworked furnace is extremely uncomfortable to push into. It physically clogs a lane, and the non-stop stream of fire spirits forces awkward responses. The longer it stands still attacking on your side of the arena, the more total spirits it ends up spawning. This makes it even worse than the old furnace, as that would at least decay due to it having a lifetime of 28 seconds, but the new furnace wouldn't stop spawning fire spirits until it was taken out. Those spirits also retarget independently, meaning they can jump onto a balloon even if the furnace itself is locked onto something like a lava hound. You can even pressure one lane while defending the other, since its range allows it to influence both sides. Spell interactions changed drastically too. Fireball no longer kills the value of the card, because Furnace keeps producing spirits afterward. Lightning and Rocket are massive overcommitments unless they chip something else. Poison is the cleanest answer because it damages both the Furnace and multiple waves of spirits at once. But even then, the spirits still jump through damage, which limits how effective that counter really is. Unlike traditional spawners like the Witch, the spirits don't protect the furnace itself. There are no meat shields, and it's relatively fragile for its cost. In some situations, the spirits can even work against it by retargeting poorly. Because of that fragility and its low DPS, Furnace doesn't fit well into heavy decks. It thrives far more in cycle-based control decks, where cheap cards can constantly protect it, reset pressure, and convert its chip into real advantage. In the end, the rework turned Furnace from a passive, forgettable chip building into a high-skill, timing-based control card. It no longer wins through slow inevitability. Now it wins through precision, positioning, and relentless pressure. Oh, and that's just the normal version, so let's quickly go over its evolution. Evo Furnace is 2 cycles and turns the spawn speed to 1.8 seconds instead of 5 when it's attacking. That doesn't sound too crazy, but those fire spirits add up pretty quickly. So where did the Furnace shine on release? Logbait, Hog Cycle, maybe Graveyard? What if I told you it was Furnace Cycle? Oh yeah, it's one of those cards. One so broken that simply having more of them wins you the game. Same as Goblin Machine and Phoenix. With only a few days, the Furnace received an emergency nerf. Its health was reduced by a whopping 19%, allowing it to die to poison and have it in a similar HP range as the Musketeer and Wizard. But the spawn rate was also increased. Instead of every 5 seconds, the Furnace would now spawn a Fire Spirit every 7. This nerf was very deserved. Now it wasn't overpowered to the point you'd play 1.9 Furnace Cycle. But this nerf turned the Furnace even stronger somehow. SK Morton, who was ranked number 15 at the time, was playing a Graveyard deck with Furnace. Now that the Furnace and Evolved Furnace die cleanly to Poison, Poison became more meta, and most players instinctively throw Poison the moment they see it. But that exact weakness is what secretly makes the deck stronger. If you were running something like Morton, the moment your opponent poisons the Furnace, you immediately punish them with Graveyard. Nobody's carrying multiple heavy spells that can shut down both the Evolved Furnace and Graveyard, and if they try to rely on bait cards like Goblin Gang or Dark Goblin to stop the Graveyard instead, you have your own poison ready for that too. It's kind of insane how adding a clear weakness to one of the core cards ends up making the entire deck more dangerous. And so in September, it was decided the Furnace could use another nerf. This nerf would be a pretty clever one. Instead of simply making the Furnace spawn fire spirits even slower, they increased its movement speed. This might seem like a buff, but that meant it would cross the bridge sooner and not be able to spawn as many fire spirits. This change finally attacked the real problem with Furnace: how long it was allowed to safely sit and generate pressure for free. By forcing it to move up sooner, you got fewer guaranteed waves, less passive chip, and far less of an ability to stack multiple furnaces behind each other. It for sure didn't kill the card overnight, but it did put it back into reality. Furnace was still playable, still annoying, but no longer this unstoppable win condition that snowballed purely off time. For the first time since its release, Furnace wasn't winning games just by existing on the field anymore. And that finally brings us to today. After years of reworks, nerfs, and redesigns, Furnace has finally settled into a stable place in Clash Royale. It's no longer a card that takes over entire matches, but it's still not the balanced nightmare it once was. Instead, it became a niche tool, a card that shines only in the right hands, in the right deck, at the right moment. Its role is smaller now, but its identity is sharper, and for a card with a history this chaotic, that might be the best ending it could have asked for. But here's the thing, Furnace wasn't the only card that had its broken era. Every single card in Clash Royale at one point reached an absolutely insane peak of power. If you want to see just how wild things really got, well, watch this video next. I'll walk you through the craziest evolutions and the most overpowered moments in CR history. I'll see you there.